everyone. Sorry, I had a bit of difficulty with my connection. And so thank you everyone for being here. My name is Rotimi Lijofi, as Johnson had mentioned. And what we'll be doing is we'll be talking briefly around risk management for learning and development professionals. Really trying to understand what risk management means and how it applies to our functions as learning and development professionals. So a bit of background about myself. A lot of the things I've done have been around learning and development, particularly when it comes to designing organizational learning systems and organizational development systems. And I've got quite a bit of experience in terms of risk management. So what we'll be doing this morning is I'll start broadly, and I'll talk broadly about risk management, and then I would narrow it down into risk management as it concerns the learning and development professional. So risk management is one of those buzzwords. I'm sure if I went around and I asked you, have you heard about risk management before? Do you know what a risk is? The popular response to everybody will be like, oh, I know what a risk is. I've heard about risk management before. What we'll be trying to do is to look at it now from a framework-based point of view. So let me use an example. So this morning, I'm meant to be part of this webinar, but I've also got a meeting, a physical meeting this morning, and that physical meeting started at 8 o'clock and is going to run till 12 o'clock. So what I've done is I've taken a break from my physical meeting to be part of the virtual session, and then when I'm done, I go back into the physical meeting, which means there's a risk or a risk event that occurred, which would mean that if I did not have a system around which I could connect to the virtual session while I'm at the physical location, the possibility would have been very high that you'd have logged in this morning and you'd have been told that the facilitator for the session isn't around, or the person who would speak to you isn't around, and then we now have to start thinking about how to manage that risk event that has occurred. And I'm sure as learning and development professionals, we've faced different instances where the outcomes that we have don't match the expectations that we had in our mind. So you've planned the training, the date of the training has come, and things haven't worked out as much. But we would also be going beyond just discussing around, planning the training. So we'll go beyond just, oh, I've planned the training, I've booked a trainer, I've booked a venue, and things didn't work out. To try and look at risk and how to manage risk from different layers of the learning process. And different layers in terms of the way we evaluate the impact and the effectiveness of learning. So I'll start with the definition of a risk. And this is a definition I came across some years back, and it has stuck with me all along. So a risk is defined as an uncertain event or set of events that, should it occur, will have an impact on the achievement of objectives. So I've highlighted 3 words there, which is uncertain, impact, and objectives. Which is, so let me use this example. So the example I used earlier, which is my time today. The objective in this case is that I should be here. So one of the objectives is that I be physically present or virtually present to be part of this webinar. So please, if I get the feedback sometimes that I talk very fast. So if you think I'm talking too fast, you can let me know in the chat section so I can slow down a bit. But people say when I talk about things I'm excited about, my voice goes up like ×2. And I'm excited about risk management and learning and development. So if the pace is fine, you can just type OK in the chat room so I'll know that the pace is fine. Okay, thank you. Okay, so talked about, so if I use the example of me being virtually present here as an example, so the objective is for me to be here. At the point where I committed and I said I was going to be here on the 27th of November by 10 o'clock in the morning, the meeting I have today, or the meeting I have now that runs from 8 to 12, was not even in the plan. It wasn't even being discussed. It wasn't something that was conceived. Which means if that meeting was fixed for yesterday or fixed for tomorrow, it would not have an impact on the achievement of the objective, which is for me to be here. So I wouldn't consider it a risk. So it means that for us to be able to discuss risks, we have to understand the objectives first. Because anything that may impact on the objectives are the things that fall within the scope of what we call risk management. If it doesn't impact on the objectives that we have, then it is not a risk, right? So when we go through the risk management process, that's where we'll talk a lot more around understanding what the objectives are that are at risk, even from a learning and development point of view. What are the objectives? They must be clear in our minds, and then we can begin to ask the questions, what are those things that will impact on our ability to achieve the objectives? So the second one there talks about the second one talks about the impact, which is what effect is it going to have on the objectives? So we need to be clear around what that effect will be. So a few minutes ago, this is Lagos. A few minutes ago, it was raining heavily. And I was a bit concerned that because of the volume of the rain that was falling, it was a bit noisy where I am, because I'm on the topmost floor. And where I am, just above me is the roof. So when the rain was pondering down on the roof, I could hear the sound was really loud. So I was a bit concerned around that. But at the point where the rain was falling, it was no longer an uncertain event. It was a certain event, which is the rain was falling already. So I had to do something about it. But if I backed up till the morning and I checked the weather forecast, and the weather forecast, for example, said there's a 60% chance of rain. A 60% chance of rain means that there's a 40% chance of it not raining. So I have a decision to make whether or not I want to deal with that certainty or uncertainty of the fact that the rain will fall or not fall over the course of the day. So risks basically are uncertain events that, if they occur, will have an impact on the objectives. If they are certain, it is not a risk, it's an issue you need to deal with. So if I had called Demoleste Johnson and said to him that I would not be available, he would no longer be dealing with a risk, he will be dealing with an issue. Because it is now certain that I will not be available. Before I say to him that I will not be available, he has to back up and then say, is there a possibility that the facilitator will not be available? So I sent him a message jokingly this morning. And I said, what is your plan in case I don't show up this morning? And interestingly, he had a plan, which was nice. So I said he was going to use my not showing up as a case study, and then discuss that in terms of risk management and what could people have done differently, which was a plan that was already in place. So that's a risk. In order to understand risks, we need to understand the anatomy of risks, the anatomy. And then we'll use all of this information I'm giving you to understand risk management. So if you look at this picture, this is a lady who has tripped, right? So if she was going to report this, she was going to tell you that I fell, right? I slipped over a puddle of water and I fell over. That's the event that has occurred. If she falls and, for example, she breaks her hips, the impact of the fall would be that her hip is broken. If she falls and let's say she breaks the heel of her shoe, or she suffers a fracture or any injury, the impact of the fall would be the injury that she has suffered. But we also need to back up, ask the question, why did she fall? Because it's not enough for us to be able to say there's a possibility that people will fall and break their hips or break their ankle or have an injury. We need to be able to understand what will cause them to fall. So looking at this picture, different people, at different points, people have given me different thoughts around why they think she fell. Some say, oh, she fell because the floor was wet. Other people will go back and say, well, the wet floor sign was after the spill. Others will say, oh, she probably was using her phone. So she didn't know, because she was using her phone, she didn't observe what was happening around her. And that was what caused her to slip and fall. So you can see here that a series of quote unquote unfortunate events have led to the fall, which means if we had placed the sign in the right place, if she wasn't using her phone, if the puddle had been cleaned up, then she wouldn't have fallen. So in managing a risk, we've got to be clear around the cause, the event, and the impact. Many times what you find is that people are focused many times on the impact. So I'll give an example. Also, let me go back to this webinar. So me not showing up is the event, right? Me not being here is the event that has occurred. If I'm not here, the event, it did not show up. What would be the impact? People will be disappointed. They would say, oh, you know what? UCAP promised that they were going to bring a facilitator and the guy didn't show up. We're unhappy. But the question would have been, what can cause me not to be available? Because once we're able to identify the various things that can cause me not to be available, it becomes easier to be able to manage the event, thereby reduce the impact. There are certain points where you may not be able to remove the cause, right? You may not be able to say, oh, this is the reason why this person may not be available. There's nothing we can do about it. So the next thing we start thinking about is how do we manage the impact and ensure that the loss or the impact of this person not showing up is significantly managed or significantly reduced. So 3 words: the cause, the event, and the impact when thinking about risks. So in dealing with risks, I'll be discussing a framework this morning, and then we'll narrow that framework into the L&D profession. So risk management, let's look at it simply in 4 steps: identify, assess, plan, implement, and then continue to identify. Because as you implement your response, new risks would occur, right? As you implement your response. So some years back, I think this was much earlier, like the early 2000s. And my route when I'm going back from work was to drive on Echo Bridge. So I'll drive on Echo Bridge, and there was always the risk that people, because then my car AC wasn't good. So I would have to wind down. People would usually come to the window and then, ask for money and then say, you know what, give me money or try to rob you because your glass was down. So what then happens is people would then decide to now wind their glasses up and say, if I wind my glass up, I'm able to reduce the probability that somebody is going to come to me and ask for money. But winding your glass up creates a new level of risk, which is the level of risk now that somebody can smash your glass, rob you. So not only have you lost your possession, they are also now going to have to replace the glass. So in terms of mitigating a risk, you've got to understand that risk management is a continuous process. It's not one of those processes where you start and then you say, I've finished managing the risks. You've got to constantly be looking at the new risks that are occurring and put in place mitigation plans to deal with those risks. The second step, and I would still go through all of the steps in detail, is to be able to assess the risks. So once the risks have been identified, the next step is to assess the risk so that you can ask the question, what is the impact of this risk on my objectives? Does it have any impact on my objectives? Does it affect anything? So Lagos is a coastal city. So Lagos is near the Atlantic Ocean. Cities that are coastal have a risk of tsunami, which means that people will say, oh, you know what, Lagos should be having a risk mitigation plan for a tsunami. But because where Lagos is located geographically, we are on relatively stable tectonic plates. The risk of a tsunami is usually, places where there are tsunamis, there's usually a high risk of an earthquake. So because Lagos is on relatively stable plates, what you then find is that the risk of a tsunami is very low. So you are not likely to find a risk mitigation plan in Lagos. Some would argue and say, well, Lagos should have or Lagos should not have. But you'll find that that assessment helps to determine what your plan of response will be. It is not every risk that you identify that you need to put in place plans for. Another example that many people can relate with, a large majority of insured vehicles in Nigeria, which is, so when you take insurance, you're actually mitigating against the risk, which is the risk that if anything happens to your car, that risk can be transferred to a third party, to someone else. But majority of people who own vehicles in Nigeria have third-party insurance. Third-party insurance basically means that the insurance company will fix the damage that you've caused, but not necessarily fix your own vehicle. Which means that you've chosen, by looking at the responses, to say, well, I don't think I'm going to create any damage in the course of the year that is going to be up to X amount. So because I won't create any damage that is up to X amount, I'm going to take on that risk myself and pay third party. But there's now a residual risk, which is if you create that damage above 5,000 naira, you now have to pay out of pocket. So in terms of the risk response and planning, it's a cyclic process. It's not one of those processes where you start and then, you stop the process because you think I'm done. So the next step would now be to plan what your response will be. So you plan your response, you monitor things, and as you monitor things, you implement the plan. So you're implementing your plan. There are certain points where you have a plan and the plan doesn't work. So I use the example of Johnson's plan, which was, we'll talk about the case study of why the facilitator didn't show up, and then we'll try and say what could we have done differently. He had that plan, but he didn't have a need to implement the plan. So it is not. So don't always think that because I have a plan, I must implement the plan by force. If the risk does not occur, the plan doesn't have to be implemented. So let's take each of these steps one by one and discuss it in more detail. So the first step is identify. And before you can identify the risks, the first question must be, what are the objectives? What objectives are at stake? And when we narrow this down a bit, we'll look at an objective from a learning and development professional's point of view. But as I said earlier, I'll first start broadly, then we narrow down into learning and development. So what are the objectives? For example, if you're organizing a training and you're putting people together in a room, you can look at the objectives of the training at different levels. So you can look at it purely in terms of the reaction, the learning experience that people have. You can look at the objectives from a point of view of what's learning. You can look at the reaction from a point of view of what are the behaviors that have changed. And you can look at the objectives from a point of view of the impact that you want. So what I've basically summarized is the Kirkpatrick model of evaluation. So you can look at the objectives from all of those levels and say, what are the objectives from a reaction point of view? So when I say reaction point of view, you look at learnings like, okay, so people who are going to this training, where are they going? Is the facility they are going for the training a conducive facility? Will the food be good? Is there going to be traffic on their way there? So you set out those objectives. Well, I don't want people to spend more than 30 minutes leaving their house to get to the training venue. I want a training venue that can accommodate everybody and have put in place all of the COVID protocols. All of those are things you're looking at from a reaction point of view. The next layer, and don't worry, if you're not getting this, I'll still show a picture that talks about it more. The next layer is now the learning point of view, which is where you now begin to talk about the learning objectives, where you now say, at the end of this training, people should be able to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's where the Bloom's taxonomy now comes in. They should be able to do, they should be able to apply, they should be able to ensure or design. So all of those are objectives that you now set at a learning point of view. So you've got to ask yourself, what are the objectives from a learning point of view? The third layer would then be from a behavioral point of view, which is, as a result of the learning, what are the new behaviors that people need to pick up? So are there things that they need to change? So an example is you've got people on your team who struggle with planning. So they struggle with project planning. You say to them that I'm going to send you on a planning training or a leadership training. Let's use leadership because that's the common thing now. I'm going to send you on a leadership training. So at the end of leadership training, you should be able to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you state those 4 things in terms of your learning objectives. When they come back, what are the behavioral objectives I expect to see as a result of the fact that people have gone through this training? So for example, I can say I want to see faster decision making within the organization. I want people to have higher levels of engagement or interactions with their subordinates. All of those are the behaviors you want to see. Those are objectives. So the question when we talk about assess is, what can stop me from achieving these objectives I've set? Then the third layer is now the impact. So at an impact point of view, you're basically saying, as a result of these behavioral changes, what will change or what will be the impact on the business? So the next layer above that, you can now begin to discuss what will be the return on the investment. How does this significantly impact on our achievement of our business objectives? Because all of those layers cascade into the objectives of the business. And at different layers of the learning and development function, different objectives matter. And those objectives are important. So you usually see the disconnect between learning and development and the business, in that learning and development many times is focusing on reaction and learning. So do people like the learning experience? And then did they learn? But the business still has objectives around. So you find the common one is, we train our people, but we will not see the impact of the training because they would leave, right? So they are saying that there is a risk that we will not see the impact, not without a problem with the reaction, without a problem with the learning, without a problem with the behavior. Our concern is around the impact. So they now say things like, you must sign a training bond. But then the question then is, what will be the impact of that training bond on the behaviors that we expect to get? What will be the impact of the training bond on the learning process itself? What will be the impact of the training bond on the reactions? Which is why I said to you that the risk management process is a cyclic process. You've also seen the same thing with e-learning. So you say things like, we want to have a conversion of our e-learning mix. We want more people, we want 60% of our courses to be delivered via electronic platforms. Good, nice objective. What will stop people from being able to meet these objectives? So you've got to ask those questions. So the second step within the identify phase is now to ask the question, what can impact the achievement of the objectives? So as I go on, it's important to remember that risks can be negative and positive, right? So there are certain uncertain events that may significantly improve the achievement of objectives. So an example is, you found a lot of organizations that, from a learning point of view, they met their objectives during the lockdown. So many of the trainings that people were meant to do, they just loaded it on them during the lockdown. Do this training, do that training, and then people started learning things that you were wondering where they would use it. So I see somebody who is I don't know, maybe a person is doing blockchain technology, and I think, okay, connect it for me. And like, no, people can't just sit at home, so they must learn something. So you are finding that the uncertain event created an opportunity. So don't think of risks purely in terms of negatives. There are certain times where the uncertain events can lead to positive outcomes that you were not expecting. So the next question for you when identifying is, what can impact the achievement of the objectives? And this is where the risks come to play. Many times we think of what are the things that can impact it negatively, and rightly so, because if you don't think of the things that can impact it negatively, you won't even deliver the objectives. But you also need to be able to say, what are those things that can impact it positively? So you can then begin to look at the opportunities, while those things that can impact it negatively are the threats, right? So you have the opportunities and the threats. So if you go back to the SWOT analysis, the strengths within your organization create opportunities for you to achieve your objectives. The weaknesses in your organization create threats to the achievement of your objectives. Okay, so the next question will be, what are the risks? And then you write them down. And always remember, when thinking about the risks, I'll go back 2 slides to think about the cause, the event, and the impact. So don't just say, oh, there's a risk that people would not learn, which will mean we've wasted money. Why will they not learn? So we've got to understand that cause, because if we don't understand the cause, we cannot deal with it, we cannot manage the event, and we cannot reduce the impact, if possible. Okay, so if you are with me, just type check in the box so I know that we're still on point. So just say I'm with you, so that I'll know that we're all on track. Okay, so thank you. Thank you. Okay, so I know we're on track. So the next step is now to begin to look at assess. So in terms of assessing, the question is really, what is so you're assessing 2 things majorly. 1, what is the probability that the risk event will occur? And then 2, if it does occur, what is the impact? So what's the probability? And we can look at probability on 3 scales in terms of, let's even use simple scales of high probability, medium probability, low probability. Low probability means it's not very likely that it will occur. It's not very likely. So let's use an example. Someone says, oh, we may not be able to attend the trainings because there would be a lockdown. So there's likely to be maybe, I don't even know if it's the 3rd wave now, or the 4th wave, or the 5th wave. There'll be a new wave and there'll be a lockdown. So you've got to ask the question, what is the probability that there will be that new wave? Do you think it's high? Do you think it's medium? Do you think it's low? And when making these decisions, it's important you're not making it alone. Because many times what we do is we just sit down as learning and development people behind the desk and now begin to take paper. Is it going to happen? They lock down in France, they lock down in South Africa, therefore we will lock down in Nigeria. Full stop. Conclude. But it doesn't always work that way. You've got to be able to ask questions, engage people who are experts within the field, and get their point of view. To say, okay, what is the probability that this thing will occur? What is the, is it high probability? For example, you could say if it has never been seen before, it's low probability. The fact that it is low probability does not mean it cannot have high impact, right? So we go back to 2020, right? When 2020 started, in December, there was a low probability in most people's minds that there would be a lockdown. So for many people, there was no response plan. They knew the impact would be high, but we did not have a response plan. In fact, many people up until January, February kept saying Nigeria will not lock down. Some said, oh, Corona cannot survive in Nigeria. And we had all of those different postulations that we came up with. So the assess phase is really around helping us understand what the probability of the risk will be and what the impact of the risk will be. And then we can make a decision once we understand the impact would then be what will be the effect. So you can look at impact in terms of what's the financial impact, how does it impact us from a reputational point of view, are there any health and safety concerns, are there any legal concerns that we need to be mindful of? But look at the impact broadly. How does this risk impact us? So you may find organizations who say things like, if this risk is going to affect our reputation, don't take it. If this risk is going to affect us from a legal point of view, don't take it. If this risk is going to affect us from a health and safety point of view, don't take it. So you've got to be able to identify those within the organization who can make decisions when it comes to things that are legal, or those who can make decisions when it comes to things that are, so I use the example of the training bonds many times. So learning and development sits down, you craft a training bond because you think people, you want to manage the risks that they go. But the legal guys never looked at it to be sure whether it's a legally binding document, whether all of the angles have been covered. So we just send out the document, and the first time we have to contest that document, everything falls flat on its face. So in terms of assessing, we've always got to think about those two parts. Who are those who can make the best judgment around the impact, and who are those who can make the best judgment around the probability of the risk? So if we were to create a matrix out of this, you can have probability on this side and impact on this side. So you've got unlikely, likely, very likely. So you could say, well, risks, and this is now dependent on your organization. You've got to determine what your response will be. You can say risks that fall within the green band, we would accept the risks. We won't do anything about it. We won't, we don't have to say if a risk has low probability of occurring and a very low impact if it occurs, then we won't do anything about it. So an example is people go to a trade for trainings, and your preference will be that they have sweets on the table, sweets and chewing gum to keep people awake. And I've had an instance actually where we were designing a training, and part of people who were coming for the training requested that there should be cola nuts. That one of the things they wanted was that there should be cola nuts. I'm sure you can guess what sector they came from. So they had a requirement and said there should be cola nuts on the table. The truth is, the cola nuts, the absence or presence of the cola nuts would not significantly impact on either the reaction or the learning. Well, it might have an impact on reaction because people might then say, because there was no cola nuts, I'm not happy with the training. But it wouldn't have a significant impact on the learning. So you'll find that, somebody said government and ministries. You said it, not me. But actually, you're correct. So you find that the impact of that is low, and the probability is low. So what you then find is that you are likely to accept that risk and say, but I wouldn't break a neck to get cola nuts to be there. And then you now have risks where they could be high impact and high probability of occurring, which are the ones you call the unacceptable risk, and say, you know what, I cannot accept this risk. I've got to do something about it. I'm going to change the course of action or do something different. So I'll give you an example. So some years back, we were organizing a training, and we were getting a trainer in from, I think she was coming in from South Africa. And we had already gone through all the hoops of, getting, I think we had bought the ticket, we had done the hotel booking. But at that time, there were the tensions between Nigeria and South Africa when it came to it from a visa point of view. So while everything else was planned, the one thing that was remaining was the visa. The training was to start on a Monday. By Thursday, we will call the trainer and say, how far? Have you gotten your visa? She would say, oh, no. They said to me that I'll get it. No, Monday we'll call, she said, I'll get it Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So Thursday. And that became a case of, how far with your visa? Oh, they said I'll get it by tomorrow, definitely. So we're rest assured that, she'll get it by tomorrow, which means she'll fly into the country and she'll be able to take the training. And it was one of those trainings where I think there were only about 3 people who could deliver that training in the world at that time. It was a very specialized training. I think it was called the Open Group Architecture Framework, TOGAF. It was a very specialized training. She was one of the 3 people. I think she was the first person who was qualified in Africa or something of that nature. So when she called on Friday and said, they told me I'll get my visa on Friday, everybody was happy and said, oh yeah, we're good to go. So we confirmed to everybody in our naivety and said, everybody come for the training would hold. So, people started booking their tickets to come in from all over town to attend the training. Then 2 o'clock on Friday, how far? 3 o'clock, how far? 4 o'clock, how far? Up until the end of the day, she didn't get her visa. She didn't get it. So we now had to start calling people and dealing with the what's it called? I'm looking for the English. English has failed me now. The reactions, but that's not the word I was thinking of. I think reaction is so it works. The reaction, the fallout. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for. The fallout of having to make that decision for people who have already bought their tickets to come from town, who had booked hotels that they could not get refunds on, because we accepted a risk that we simply should not have accepted. We should have put in place a plan at that point, and maybe by Friday, say to people that, you know what, we're going to move this training by a week to give us more time to book the tickets, or even had done the virtual. I think what we eventually did was the person connected by Skype. I think what we did was the person connected by Skype on Monday, but we didn't think of that plan until we got the fallout. But if we had thought of that plan, we could have communicated that plan in communicating that, you know, you come for the training, but for the first day, the trainer, I think the trainer came in on Wednesday morning. So I think Monday, Tuesday was done virtually. She flew in overnight and then continued on Wednesday. So on Wednesday, we started a bit late because people knew that the trainer was coming in by air. But because we hadn't been deliberate about identifying and assessing that risk, it was difficult for us to plan and communicate an appropriate response. So in terms of planning is then what can I do to reduce the impact of the risk event or the probability of the risk, or both? So what can I do to reduce the impact or the probability of the risk occurring, or both? So in terms of responses, there are 3 types of responses. So I'll use an acronym and I'll type it in the chat as I go on. So the first one is what is called, so I'll use the acronym PRACT. So P-R-A-C-T, PRACT. PRACT. So P stands for prevent. So what prevent simply means is that we do things differently to ensure that the risk does not occur. So for example, if there is a risk that a trainer coming from outside the country will not get a visa, they will not use a foreign trainer. But it is not in every instance that you can prevent. So in this case, it was difficult to prevent because we did not have an option locally. So we could not say, oh, because of this risk, we will prevent the risk from occurring by doing things differently. So we now begin to think of ways by which we can reduce. So in terms of reducing from a planning point of view, we can look at ways to reduce the probability of the risk occurring or reduce the impact should it occur. Reducing the probability of the risk occurring would have been to start that application process much earlier. So if the process takes 2 weeks for the visa to come out, then we should start maybe 5 weeks before, understanding that there could most likely be delays, which is we're trying to reduce the probability. What we did by using the Skype solution was us reducing the impact. So the next step will be to decide whether you can reduce the probability and reduce the impact. And don't just say we're going to reduce. The question should be, what are we going to do to reduce? What are we going to do to reduce the probability or to reduce the impact? There are some points you may find where, so I'll use an example. If you bought a car for 2 million naira and somebody says to you, insure this car for 1.5 million naira. So it's by show of hands. I think you can raise, there's the raise hands option, right? Or you can unmute and even say, how many people will pay 1.5 million naira to insure their 2 million naira car? So you pay 1.5 million to insure a 2 million naira car. How many people will not? Okay, so we have one hand that will. How many people will not? Yeah? You will not. So I've seen one hand, will not. So what you are most likely going to do is just accept the risk and say, well, there is so this is 500K gamble. So you most likely say to yourself, well, then it means there's more than a 50% chance that my car will not be stolen. So I'm not paying 1.5. So I'm going to accept the risk. Right? Oh, somebody says it depends on how important the car is to you. So you've gone back and you've hit the nail on there when we talked about the objectives. So you see now that you cannot make a risk decision if you don't first understand. So let me just back up to that slide. If you don't understand the objectives. So what you've just done now is you've changed the context. And by changing the context, the objectives are different. So suddenly the objective is no longer to insure a 2 million naira vehicle. The objective is to insure a 300 million naira vehicle that you bought for 2 million naira. Right? So it's key. That's why those steps are there, because you can then take each of the steps one in order to go. So if you haven't identified, you can't plan. Because all of the decisions you make from a planning point of view will be flawed if the identification hasn't been done properly. So the final step is now, after you've planned, go and implement the plan. But don't just implement, you monitor first. So monitor how events play out, and based on the way the events play out, you can then make a decision around how you implement the plans that you've put in place. So that, in a nutshell, is the risk management framework. Well, I said I was going to bring it home to try and see how it affects the learning and development professional. And we'll do that using the Kirkpatrick model of evaluation. So if we take the learning experience and we try and evaluate it across these 4 layers of evaluation. So you start from the first point of view is when a person is going on training, the first thing that many people consider is to do an evaluation of reaction. And reaction many times has to do with the people's feeling towards the training. How did they feel about the training? So you go to a training venue, how did they feel about the training venue they went to? Did they like the trainer? Did they like the food? Did they like the ambience around the place? And what you then find more commonly now is when you say to people, go and take an online course. What is the reaction to the online course? Do people like the experience when they go and they log into the platform, and maybe it's a voice that they generally don't feel comfortable listening to, and all of that? So somebody says no free food. So maybe you go inside, when you go for online course, there's no free food. So maybe you now send food to people's houses and say, this is the food for the online course that you want to, and all of that. So the question would then be, what are the objectives we have from a reaction point of view, in terms of the experience that people go to when they attend a training? Okay, so people just go in there, and if you don't look at the reactions that people have at the end of the training, because that is really an evaluation of the training event. So we've got to understand the objectives from a training event point of view and ask the question, what are the risks that can impact on us getting the right reaction? So an example is, if we don't have a budget, a proper budget for training, the chances that we will get a good training venue and a good training provider is low, which means we've now got to think of ways to work around that risk. So it might now be where people then do, okay, instead of sending 10 people on the training, we're going to send 2 people on the training, and then when they come back, we would have a deliberate knowledge transfer process. Because if we send the 10 people, we may not be able to hit the reaction objectives that we have. But everything I say is I'm looking for the word. I'm not prescribing any particular solutions to the organization, because what you've got to do is to go back and be able to evaluate your context and then make risk management decisions based on the context of your organization. So that's the reaction. So we've got to be clear around those reaction point of views. If it's e-learning and people are going to learn online, what are the standards that we have in terms of expectations for objectives? How should the courses be designed? How should the courses be delivered? So I'm trying very hard. I'm going to use this example carefully. I've known people who have said to me, and because this is recorded, I'll be very extra careful too. I've known people who have said to me that there are particular intonations that they don't like hearing on e-learning courses. So when I play an e-learning course and it's this particular accent, it just does my head in. And you understand that. So you say, okay, well, if you're going to get people to go to the trainings, it means if we put this particular type of product in front of them, then there's going to be a reaction problem, because they're going to react wrongly to these trainings, which would affect our ability to hit our reaction objectives. The next layer, after people have accepted the reactions and they like it, is now learning. And I think that's where maybe that's what Shei's comment is alluding to, which is, now I like the venue, I like the e-learning course, I like the food, I like the trainer. You know, people go on trainings and say to them, oh, how was the trainer? Oh, the trainer was really wonderful. It was fantastic. I really liked him, or I liked her, you know, used ready examples and all of that. And it's okay, so what did you learn? And the person begins to scratch their head and say, well, I didn't, it was not a good training, but what did you learn? So the next layer is then to say, what are the learning objectives? So majorly what we do many times as learning and development professionals is we craft out those objectives and say, these are our learning objectives. So the question would then be, how can we What are those things that may impact on the ability of the people to learn? Because you may be sending the wrong people to the right training or the right people to the wrong training, but one of the two is wrong. That people are going to trainings where there hasn't been any needs analysis that has been done to ensure that this is actually a training that I need. So a person is on a 5-day training when what he actually needed was probably a 30 minutes crash course or a micro course on a particular aspect. But we sent him on a 5-day training and he's sitting there day 1, day 2, day 3, waiting for the point where they will reach their own case and say, okay, when would they talk about the exact reason why I've come to this training? So the question would always be, what are the learning objectives? What are those risks that may impact on the ability of the learner to understand the objectives, which then impacts on the design of the learning intervention itself? Some interventions are classroom learning, where people go for 3 days, they come out of the 3 days, and they can run. There are some that require coaching, because you're not just trying to build skills, you're trying to change behavior. So in designing for learning, you've got to always look at what are the risks to those objectives, what are those things that may impact on the ability of people to learn. Reaction is one of the key, the reaction layer is one of the key inhibitors of learning. If we solve reaction, now we've got to learning and ensure that people would actually learn when they go on those courses. What will stop them from learning? What will stop them from being able to assimilate or absorb the context that has been shared with them? And we've got to identify those risks as clearly as possible. What are the risks, and have mitigation plans in place against those risks? So you find people who do things like they have approved training organizations. They say we only go to these training organizations because we can guarantee the learning, or we only talk to this particular type of organizations because they can pass learning across in a way that we can understand, we can relate with, and we can use. So now that people have learned, there's another layer within the organization, and this layer is a collaboration between the learning and in the evaluation model, rather, is a collaboration between the learning and development function and the managers, the line managers. Because we've got to now ask the question, now that people have learned, what are the behaviors, or what do we expect them to do differently as a result of the things that they've learned? Another question there is, what are the things that may impact their ability to do things differently? So you send people, for example, on training on email etiquette, but nobody reads mails within the organization. So they've come back and they want to start typing mails, but nobody's reading the mails. What then happens is everybody rolls back because the systems that will drive the desired behavior don't exist within the organization. So it's key for you to understand what are the objectives from a behavioral point of view, and what are the things that may stop people from being able to use what they've learned within the organization. So we say, oh, people need to go for trainings on innovation. We need to be more innovative. So they've gone for the trainings on innovation. They've come back, but there's a culture within the organization that shuts down creative ideas. So people come and say, you're not paid to think, you're paid to do. So the person has gone, but the systems within the organization don't provide a platform for them to be able to use the learning to change behavior. So the question should then be, what are the inhibitors from a behavioral point of view? So they begin to do things like the culture audits, to ask what are the ways we do things around here, and how does that impact on the ability of the organization to translate learning into behaviors? And then be clear about those risks. So question, remember the anatomy of the risks, the cause, the event, and the impact. So you want to be able to look at it and say, what are the events that will, or people will not do it? So you hear many times, in fact, I hear this a lot if as a trainer. So you train people and they say to you, oh, we won't do it in our organization. And you're asking, why would you not do it in your organization? Because we just don't work that way. Which means it doesn't matter the learning that you are learning. Pardon the structure of the grammar. It doesn't matter the learning that you are learning. It would not change behavior because the structures within the organization are a risk to people having the right behaviors to use the skills that they have learned from the trainings. And then the third leg would then be the results or the impact. So the question for learning and development professionals is, if now we've sorted out, we've looked at the reactions, people like the training events, they've learned, the behaviors are right, but what are the things that affect the ability of those results to be, those behaviors to be translated into results within the organization? And these are broader discussions that happen at the top layers of the organization. And when I mean the top layer, because this is a discussion that your CFO will constantly have with you. and say, okay, last year you spent a budget of, you spent 420 or 420 million on it. So you spent 420 million on trainings. How has it impacted on the bottom line? Last year, our turnover was X billion. This year, our turnover is X times 1.02 of last year. So we haven't grown marginally. So how are you able to tie all of those behavioral changes to the results within the organization so that those results can support the drive for learning? And that's the tough nut that learning and development professionals have tried to crack over the years, because it's a key risk that we constantly find. And the only way that can be achieved is that process of risk management and tying the objectives must start from the lowest level of reaction up until the point where it is driven to the results and the return on investment, which is how have those behaviors affected the results. Those objectives from a results point of view must be clearly documented from the start, which is, if it's innovation, the results we want is that we have innovative ideas that go to market. And then we can set timelines and say in 5 years, we want our product mix to be 20% of solutions that have been designed internally within the organization from the point of conception to design and rollout that are unique to the market. So we then need to now start asking questions. What are those things? And this is where organizational development comes in. So we've moved beyond just organizational learning to now, how do we develop the organization in such a way that we move from just teaching people things to then being able to tie all of those development initiatives to the results that the organization is delivering from a clear point of view. So it's easy to say 20% of the products that we have in the organization over the last 3 years have been designed internally from start to finish. And there's metrics to show that. So the constant changes or the constant work that the learning and development team is doing with the people within the organization is to say, what are the bottlenecks that are stopping all of the investments we are making in trainings from being translated into the reality of the business? I think we've hit 11:01. So I'd like to thank you so much for listening. I think we can have a few minutes of discussions around this topic. If you have any questions or any additions, it's a discussion, so please feel free to add more to it. But thank you so much for taking our time this Saturday morning to let me bore you for a while. So thank you so much.